Dancing with the Devil, Chronicles of a Black Witch's Legacy. Scary story. Although I am a few days away from turning 100 years old, I do not consider myself an obsolete old woman. As I am illiterate, I asked my granddaughter Rosario to write my story because I know that soon I will die. I confess that I do not regret what I am or what I have done. I begin by saying that I did not choose to be this. What I was converted into was by inheritance. My great-grandmother was a witch. My grandmother and my mother were also powerful witches of those who made a pact with the devil. Precisely because of the pact is that they were long-lived. They were more than 100 years old when they died. That is also why, when I reach that age, I already feel my death, besides something else that I will tell you here. My great-grandmother, my grandmother, my mother, all of them were wise and intelligent, just as they had the ability to help people. They also had the ability to do evil. They were black witches whose names I will keep to myself. I did not know my great-grandmother, but I know from my mother that she was considered a cauldron witch. She could transform herself into an animal. Sometimes she flew, but not on a broom. As they say witches fly, she flew as a ball of fire. She was a supreme mother witch, descendant of child-eating witches from Europe, active in the invocations, always at the head of the covens. She formed a triad, together with my grandmother and my mother. She was catalogued as an ancient witch, very dangerous, who had a very notable grudge against the Holy Inquisition, a connoisseur of herbalism for white magic and of witchcraft for black magic. A white or black witch will always be seen as bad. That is why there were times that in different towns they wanted to lynch her, but because of her abilities, they could never even touch her. In addition, not anyone dared to harm her because she was implacable with the people she hated. When she attacked someone, it was certain death. She was also very respected by other witches. They came to her for advice or help. She was a midwife, but just as she helped to bring life, she also helped to take it away from someone. She had no consideration or pity for people. She worked with the intention of destroying them. I also knew that she could dry up crops. Sometimes she cursed animals, which died without remedy. I did know my grandmother. She was a witch by birth. Apart from being a spiritualist, she handled sorcery and voodoo. She was always a solitary woman. I almost never talked to her. She was feared and respected because as she had a pact with the devil, she was powerful, with a strong voice, with a very hard heart. Many people were afraid of her. It was said that she was the cause of several deaths, and also blamed her for many diseases resulting from her spells. She was sought after to talk to the dead, because by practicing voodoo, she had a strong connection with the afterlife. An expert in reversing spells, casting spells, or curses. She also made astral travels, or something similar. She would fall asleep for several days while her spirit wandered. Not only that, she also had the ability to disappear from one place and appear in another. Sometimes she would return wounded, but she would recover. I have very few memories of her. The only thing I can tell, and that I keep in my memory very vaguely, was when one night when I was just a little girl, I spied her through a crack in her room. She was kneeling with her hands raised, palms up. Her face was disfigured. She was making a request to someone I could not see. I could only hear another voice, very different from my grandmother's. That voice was hoarse, dry, as if from beyond the grave. She said she did not want to make any more pacts, that she could not comply with what she was asking. She preferred to die because she was already tired. that it was time to sleep, the eternal sleep. The mission she had been entrusted with had been accomplished, feeling satisfied. Then she bowed her head. I think she began to pray because she was talking quietly for a long time. She took off a scapular that she always wore and put it on the floor. Then she lay face down with her arms apart. He began to tremble. Black smoke was coming out of his body, as if he was burning inside, but he didn't complain, and he never screamed, so I can't say that I was scared. As he did not move, I decided to go to bed before doing so. I saw that the light in his room was gone, leaving everything in darkness, totally silent. Because of my young age, I did not understand what was really happening. When dawn broke, we woke up with the news that my grandmother had died. My mother was wearing the scapular, as well as a ring that my grandmother never took off. When I entered the room, she was lying on the floor, just as she was the last time I saw her. She looked older. She seemed to have been dead for months. She was full of scars. It was as if she was dry. She had cracks on her hands, but no trace of blood. She was too thin. Her skin was almost stuck to her bones. She looked more like a mannequin than my grandmother's body. She didn't make any impression on me. I wasn't afraid. I didn't even cry. I just stared at her for a long time until my mother came in, ordered me to get out of there, then lit some candles. I don't remember any funeral. In the middle of the morning, other women arrived. They wrapped my grandmother in a blanket. They locked themselves up for a while with the body, and I didn't know anymore. I don't even know where she is buried or what they did with her body. Obviously, they were not going to put her in a holy field because of what my grandmother was and what she represented. That is why I always suspected that she is buried in a corner of her room. I remember that sometimes at night, the light in her room would be on. I would run to peek through the crack, but as soon as I got there, the light would go out. On more than one occasion, I heard her laughter. My mother was in her room. There was no one there. The only time I asked my mother what had happened to my grandmother, she only answered that it was time to give up her soul. She told me that the same thing was going to happen to her and to me too. After that day, my mother behaved like my grandmother. She became very quiet. It seemed that she kept many secrets. Many people came to her for help, but also sought her to do black works, which at that time I still did not know what they were. Witchcraft, dark arts, evil were, so to speak, the specialty of my mother, the witch major, as she was now called in the whole town. When my grandmother passed away, my mother told me that I would help her, that I would become a witch. That was an inheritance that generation after generation had not been broken, and I was not going to do it now. I had to live and learn with my mother how to bewitch people, make ties, separation, works, cast curses, spells, many more dark things. She tortured people from a distance, putting photographs in jars to alter their minds. Others put them in front of candles to provoke diseases. All this I saw and learned as a child. Instead of going to school, my mother taught me witchcraft in her eagerness to turn me into what she was. I never objected. Besides, I was used to live all that, to feel the bad vibes, to see frightening things. I lived with witches. I did not know any other way of life. At night, I would go with her to collect earth from the cemetery. The gravedigger would let her in after midnight. He was very kind. He always gave her human bones as a gift to be nice to her. We also buried all kinds of works in that cemetery. Photographs, hair, jars. On one occasion, she buried a toad sewn from the mouth. She buried chicken heads and other things. My mother never knew fear, as she had a pact with the devil. There was nothing to be afraid of. Every day, people came to visit her, not only from the village, but also from outside, from all walks of life. Most of them wanted to harm their own relatives. That's how I learned black magic. From a very young age, I knew how to cast spells. Maybe it sounds strong, but I also learned not to feel compassion for anyone. My mother only taught me witchcraft to do evil. She never taught me how to cure people. She told me that it was useless. So, little by little, she prepared me to be a black witch. When I was older, she allowed me to do some work, always under her hard gaze. She did not like mistakes. When I rarely made them, she punished me with a stick or left me without food. The only thing I could talk to her about was witchcraft, how to do evil, how to harm people. Very occasionally, she touched the subject of the Holy Inquisition, although her favorite subject was the pact with the devil. He told me that if I wanted, I could have everything. Although it seemed incredible the devil could hold my death until I was 100 or 150 years old. It all depended on knowing how to worship and knowing how to make a pact. As the years went by, I became a real witch, although always limited to what my mother taught me, because I could not read her many books. I did not know how. Sometimes I think that is why she never sent me to school. I never got out of the habit of spying. That's why I knew that just as my grandmother did. My mother also talked to someone who was unseen, but now I know it was the devil. She worshipped him in many ways. She even offered him the souls of some people in exchange for wisdom. Other times the devil allowed her to talk to my great-grandmother, with whom she would spend hours talking and laughing. But no matter how hard I tried, I could never see her. When she knew that I was ready, she told me that it was time to make a pact with the devil to convert me to what I was really destined for. It was time to transcend. She asked me to be ready. That same night, after 3 o'clock in the morning, my mother took me to the room that had been my grandmother's. She ordered me not to speak until I was asked something, to bow my head when I addressed the Lord. As I entered, I saw that there were some people, all in black. I cannot be sure if they were men or women, because we were only illuminated with some candles. My mother presided over the rite. From what little I could understand, they would soon invoke the devil so that I would make a pact with him. Then they passed me to the front. All the people repeated a phrase that was difficult to pronounce. From outside, they brought smoking flasks. They put them in the middle of the room in front of me. Then they all formed a circle around me. One of them approached to throw some dry herbs to start what they called Faustian pact. When I could see the person closely, I recognized her. She was my dead grandmother. A smoke arose that soon invaded the whole room. Also, a horrible smell spread. The flames of the candles seemed to swirl. In the middle of all that smoke, the aberrant figure of the devil appeared. I confess that I was impressed. It was the first time I saw him. He was huge, totally pale, as if he had no blood, with huge and twisted horns. I am a witch horror story. I felt a fear invade me that I had never experienced before. I noticed that he had no lips because all his teeth were showing. Besides, I couldn't stop looking at his eyes red like fire. I felt helpless. Little thing. I remembered that one day I heard my grandmother say that there were more witches than warlocks, because women are weaker before the devil. When I turned to look at my mother, I met her cold gaze. I remembered what she had ordered me. I lowered my head as a sign of respect and submission. I stayed like that while my mother introduced me to the devil, the Dark Lord as she called him. When my mother gave me the order, I raised my head to see him face to face. Then I offered to give him my soul at the hour of my death in exchange for wisdom, power, and knowledge. I recognized him as my God, so that he would give me his protection. As it was the first time I made that pact, it would only be for 50 years. If my behavior was to his liking, I could make the pact again. If not, I would die. The 50 years began to run from that night that the agreement was sealed. I was already 20 years old. My mother ordered me to stick my head to the floor again. Instantly, I felt a horrible burning in it. It was as if I was burning. Hundreds of memories went through my mind. I imagined that the devil touched me with his hand to transmit me part of his evil. In a conversation I had later with my mother, she told me that the devil put his foot on my head, demonstrating and warning me that he was the owner of my life. I did not realize when it was all over. When I raised my head, I saw myself alone in the room. Not only the devil had disappeared, those women were no longer there, not even my mother. All the fear, uncertainty, and that strange emotion disappeared. I felt different, powerful. I felt like a witch. What I had experienced that night was just the beginning. When I left the room, I realized that it was already daylight. Although everything made me think that it had been a dream, I knew it was a tremendous reality. As the days went by, I became my mother's ally. Together, we were more feared and dangerous than ever. All the black jobs were more violent. We haunted entire families, houses, ranches, towns. I began to lose my sanity knowing that I was untouchable. No one could harm me because my life was guaranteed for 50 years. I worshipped the devil every night, and I did unmentionable practices. When I was 25 years old, I wanted to be a mother. I became interested in a married man. It was not even necessary to bewitch him, but it was necessary to bewitch his wife. I tormented her every night so that she would lose her mind, a doll with her hair, and with some practices I made her sterile, so that her husband would be disinterested in her. The following year, I had a girl. I also got rid of that man. For several days, I had his picture on ice. When I could not stand it anymore, I made an agreement with him. He would leave town or die. I have never seen him again. Time passed quickly. When I turned 55 years old, I already had a terrible record. I had done hundreds of sorceries, terrible evils, caused many separations, much suffering, all this for my mother's pleasure. She was an expert in making people suffer, in torturing them, without even touching them, leaving them without work, without family, without health, without faith. Times changed. To my mother's dissatisfaction, my daughter did not become the witch I expected. She practiced other arts, such as divination, but not black magic. That made my mother very depressed. When I turned 60 years old, I was already a grandmother. My mother looked more and more deteriorated. She was no longer the same. When the time came for her to make a new pact, she did not want to do it anymore and decided to give her soul to the devil. She asked me to be with her in those moments, so I did. When we entered her room, we did not even make an invocation because the devil was already waiting for her. My mother knelt in front of him. I stood behind her with my head bowed. The devil looked at her with displeasure. More than anger, he showed anger. With a muffled voice, my mother told him that she would not make any more pacts, that she preferred to die. He looked at her with contempt. It was not necessary for him to touch her, or for the devil to say anything. My mother fell forward and became inert. Smoke began to come out of her body, as if she had been burned. Then the devil disappeared, just like my grandmother. Her body became old and began to dry up until it was almost unrecognizable. I already knew what I had to do. I grabbed some of her belongings and buried the body in the same room where I think my grandmother is. I did it without telling anyone, without worrying, without crying. I felt alone, first without my grandmother, then without my mother, but I was not going to stop for that. I did not force my daughter to be a witch by force, but I asked her to read all the witchcraft books that my mother had. With more knowledge, I began to do more terrible works. I also became more known, to the extent that great politicians, artists, and many criminals came to me looking for amulets of protection. Time flies. Soon it was time to make another pact, because the 50 years were over. Now I would do it alone, but I was not worried. I already knew what to do. That night, I would present myself to the devil, determined to make a pact with him. I prepared an altar for him, as neither my grandmother nor my mother had done. I would do it to please him, to show him my loyalty. To my surprise and joy, he appeared before me, imposing, majestic, without any expression on his face. He did not look the same as he had 50 years ago. I was trembling with emotion at the sight of him. I felt like his slave. I was at his disposal, ready to do anything to make a pact with him again. To my surprise, the pact would be only for 30 years, not for 50 as the one that had just expired. I was a little disconcerted, but I agreed. Only now he asked me something that I found terrifying as never before. When this pact expired, I had to give him my daughter's soul, or he would not make the pact again, and he would not only take my soul, he would torture me to death in the most terrible way. He would give me back all the evil, all the witchcraft he had done to people during the next 30 years. He would make me feel in my own flesh all the pain and suffering I caused without any compassion, as I had not had for anyone. Forced, I had to accept. It was that, or I would die in an instant. I was bowed down. All my arrogance was down, and I realized that I was nothing before the power of the devil, that I represented nothing to him. I felt bound. On the one hand, I was not going to give up my daughter's soul. By not doing so, I would be repaid for all the evil I had done in the last 30 years. But I could not stop doing witchcraft. Now I understood why the body of my great-grandmother and my mother's ended in such a strange way. Filled with anger, desperation, I decided to be what I was until the end. I unloaded my anger and frustration against people, no matter if they were men or women, old people or children. All were victims equally. Thus, 30 years passed, during which I infected everything I could with the most terrible witchcraft. I did works that people had never seen. I caused as much damage as I had ever done, until the time came to pay. I will give my soul to the devil without remorse, without fear of what awaits me. Although my daughter and my granddaughter did not follow my steps, I leave knowing that witchcraft will never end. I also realized that the devil is perverse and a liar. Note: my grandmother is long dead. We found her under her bed with an expression of terror reflected in her face. She looked rotten. She was totally black. She gave off an unbearable smell of burning. Her eyes were sunken, and her tongue was missing. No one accompanied her when she presented herself to the devil on her 100th birthday. But I knew that this would happen to her when she did not give up my mother's soul. Sometimes I hear her laughing at night, in the room where she's buried with my grandmother. Her granddaughter Rosario wrote, "Thank you for joining us for this spine-tingling story. We hope you found it both thrilling and thought-provoking. If you enjoyed this video, please consider participating in our channel by subscribing, liking, and sharing it with your friends. Your support goes a long way in helping us create more engaging content for you. Goodbye, and may you always tread carefully in the world of the unknown.